When in 1788, the wealthiest monarchy in Europe couldn't afford to feed its own people, France, master of art, architecture, and military power, was drowning in debt so catastrophic that within a year, heads would roll. But here's the part they don't teach you. The bankruptcy didn't start with bread riots or angry peasants. It started in the opulent halls of Versailles, with kings who turned the treasury into their personal piggy bank. How does the richest nation on earth collapse under the weight of its own gold? Welcome to the Wealth Timeline, where we uncover how money, power, and history intertwine to shape the world we live in. Now, let's talk about the most expensive mistake in European history. In 1643, a 5-year-old boy became king of France. His name was Louis XIV, and by the time he died in 1715, he had ruled for 72 years, the longest reign of any major European monarch. History remembers him as the Sun King, the architect of absolute monarchy, the man who declared, "L'État, c'est moi. I am the state." But here's what the textbooks gloss over. Louis XIV spent France into oblivion. His obsession was Versailles. Construction began in 1661 and continued for decades. The palace consumed between 2% and 5% of France's entire annual revenue at its peak, approximately 2 billion livres in period currency, equivalent to over $300 billion today. 36,000 workers, fountains that required a hydraulic system so complex it employed 14 water wheels and 221 pumps, gold leaf covering every surface, a hall of mirrors that announced to Europe, France is untouchable, except it wasn't. Louis XIV waged 4 major wars during his reign: the War of Devolution, the Franco-Dutch War, the War of the League of Augsburg, and the War of Spanish Succession. These conflicts drained the treasury, forced emergency tax levies, and introduced France to something it had never truly confronted before: chronic structural debt. By 1715, when Louis XIV died, France's national debt stood at roughly 2 billion livres. Annual revenue, about 69 million livres. The monarchy was spending nearly 4 times what it earned. And rather than reform, Louis XIV's successors chose the same path: borrow, spend, ignore. The question wasn't whether France would collapse, it was when. Louis XV inherited the throne at age 5 in 1715. Like his great-grandfather, he ruled for decades, until 1774, and like his great-grandfather, he spent lavishly. But Louis XV added a new layer to the catastrophe: geopolitical humiliation financed by debt. The War of Austrian Succession, 1740-1748, and the 7 Years' War, 1756-1763, cost France dearly. The 7 Years' War alone, a global conflict spanning Europe, North America, and India, resulted in the loss of nearly all French colonial holdings in North America and India. France signed the Treaty of Paris in 1763, ceding Canada and Louisiana east of the Mississippi to Britain and Spain. The cost? Approximately 1.3 billion livres. The result? National pride shattered and debt ballooning to catastrophic levels. But here's the critical turning point. Rather than admit defeat and restructure, France doubled down. The monarchy borrowed heavily from private bankers, issued rentes, government bonds, and manipulated currency to delay the inevitable reckoning. By the time Louis XIV died in 1774, France's debt had grown to an estimated 4 billion livres. Interest payments alone consumed nearly half the annual budget. Enter Louis XVI in 1774, a king who never wanted the throne, married to Marie Antoinette, a woman history would blame for everything. But Louis XVI's real crime wasn't indifference. It was that he inherited a financial catastrophe no reform could fix. His finance ministers tried. Jacques Turgot proposed sweeping reforms: eliminate internal tariffs, abolish the corvée, forced labor, tax the nobility. He was dismissed within 2 years. Jacques Necker published the Compte Rendu au Roi in 1781, a financial report revealing the depth of the crisis to the public for the first time. He was dismissed. Charles Alexandre de Calonne proposed taxing the aristocracy and clergy in 1787. He was dismissed. Every attempt at fiscal responsibility was crushed by the same forces: the nobility, the clergy, and the Parlement, regional courts dominated by aristocrats who refused taxation. By 1788, France's debt had reached 5 billion livres. Debt servicing consumed over 50% of tax revenue. The monarchy was borrowing just to pay interest on previous loans, and then came the crisis that broke everything: the harvest failure of 1788. The summer of 1788 brought hailstorms that destroyed crops across northern France. By winter, bread prices had doubled. In Paris, a 4-pound loaf of bread, the daily staple for working families, cost 14.5 sous. A laborer's daily wage? About 20 sous. Families were spending 75% of their income on bread alone. Meanwhile, Versailles glittered. Louis XVI, desperate for revenue, convened the Estates General in May 1789, the first time since 1614. It was a parliamentary body representing three estates: the clergy, the nobility, and everyone else. The third estate, representing 98% of France's population, demanded real power. They were ignored. On June 17, 1789, the Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly. On July 14th, Parisian crowds stormed the Bastille. The revolution had begun, but this wasn't just political rage, it was financial desperation, weaponized by a population that finally understood the truth. The monarchy had bankrupted the nation to maintain a lifestyle of unimaginable excess. In 1790, the revolutionary government seized church lands, worth an estimated 3 billion livres, and issued assignats, paper currency backed by confiscated property. It was an attempt to inflate away the debt. By 1796, hyperinflation had rendered assignats worthless. The monarchy's debt didn't disappear. It metastasized into chaos. Here's what makes this story terrifyingly relevant. Sovereign debt crises don't stay in history books. As of 2024, France's national debt stands at approximately $3 trillion, roughly 112% of GDP. The United States carries over $36 trillion in debt. Japan's debt-to-GDP ratio exceeds 260%. These aren't medieval relics. These are modern economies facing the same structural trap, borrowing against future growth that may never materialize. The mechanics have changed. The consequences haven't. Central banks today perform the same role private lenders did in 18th century France. They enable governments to delay fiscal reckoning by monetizing debt. Quantitative easing, bond buying programs, near zero interest rates, these are the assignats of our era. And just like in 1789, the costs are socialized while the benefits concentrate at the top. Versailles has been replaced by subsidies, bailouts, and policies that insulate elites while ordinary citizens watch purchasing power erode. The question isn't whether history repeats, it's whether we're watching the same cycle unfold in slow motion. So what can we learn from the king who bankrupted France? First, debt without accountability is a time bomb. France's monarchy borrowed for decades with no intention of repayment. When the bill came due, it destroyed an entire social order. Second, structural inequality accelerates collapse. When the only people who could afford to pay taxes were exempt from paying them, the system became unsustainable. Third, financial crises don't start with riots. They start with decisions made in private. Debts hidden, reforms blocked, and warnings ignored. Louis XVI didn't cause the French Revolution. He inherited it. But by the time the people realized how deeply they'd been betrayed, it was too late to fix the system. They had to burn it down. Because in the timeline of wealth, every rise comes with a hidden cost, and sooner or later, someone always pays. If you enjoyed uncovering this hidden story, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the Wealth Timeline, and turn on the bell icon, because history's next secret is already unfolding.